Picture this: a shadowy figure crouches in a dimly lit corridor, fingers working deftly at an iron lock. The soft click of the mechanism gives way, and with it, the secrets of an entire kingdom. This wasn't just the stuff of thieves and outlaws. In the Middle Ages, lock-picking was an art form, a tool of power, and a language of betrayal. Hidden within the pages of centuries-old lock-picking manuals are the untold stories of treachery that shaped the medieval world. These weren't just instructions for breaking into chests or doors. They were blueprints for deception, used by spies, nobles, and even trusted advisors to undermine the very foundations of trust. What's truly astonishing is how these manuals reveal the psychology of betrayal in a society where loyalty was as rare as gold. Think about it. In a world where a single locked door could mean the difference between safety and sabotage, mastering the art of lock-picking wasn't just about skill, it was about control. These texts expose the chilling reality that betrayal wasn't just a crime. It was a calculated strategy, from guilds guarding their trade secrets to royal courts riddled with intrigue. The ability to pick a lock was often the key to power. And the most surprising part, these manuals weren't hidden away in secret. Some were openly circulated, proof that betrayal wasn't just accepted, it was expected. So why does this matter to us today? Because these ancient techniques and the mindset behind them still echo in our modern world. The same tactics used to manipulate locks in the Middle Ages are mirrored in the ways trust is tested and broken even now. As we peel back the layers of these preserved manuals, we're not just uncovering forgotten skills, we're decoding the timeless human drama of loyalty and deceit. This is more than a history lesson. It's a journey into the shadows of the past, where every turned lock tells a story of ambition, fear, and the fragile nature of trust. Ready to step into that world? Let's begin. The earliest lock-picking manuals reveal a world where deception was both an art and a science. Picture a master locksmith in 12th century Europe, carefully etching his knowledge onto parchment, not for common burglars, but for those who moved in the shadows of power. These texts were written in coded language, sometimes disguised as innocent trade manuals or poetry, hiding their true purpose from prying eyes. The tools they described were anything but crude. Tension wrenches made of hardened iron, skeleton keys with intricate notches. These weren't the makeshift gadgets of petty criminals. They were precision instruments, crafted with the same care as a knight's sword or a cathedral's stained glass. What's fascinating is how these manuals blurred the line between right and wrong. Some included passages justifying lock-picking as a wartime necessity, arguing that opening an enemy's chest could save lives or prevent betrayal. Others framed it as a test of loyalty. If a lord's advisor could bypass a locked door, it proved their cunning and resourcefulness. This moral ambiguity seeped into medieval culture, making betrayal a double-edged sword. A spy picking a lock for his king was a hero. That same spy caught working for a rival, a traitor deserving execution. The manuals themselves often changed hands in secret, sometimes copied by monks in monastery scriptoriums, their true purpose hidden beneath religious texts. The nobility played a key role in preserving these dangerous skills. Wealthy patrons commissioned manuals not just for espionage, but to safeguard their own secrets. If a lord knew how locks were picked, he could design stronger ones or exploit weaknesses in his rival's defenses. It was a high-stakes game of trust and suspicion, where knowledge of lock-picking meant power over both allies and enemies. And the most startling revelation, some of these texts survived not by accident, but because they were considered valuable. In a world where betrayal was inevitable, understanding the art of deception wasn't just useful, it was essential for survival. These manuals didn't just teach how to manipulate metal pins, they taught how to manipulate people. Every lock picked was a lesson in human nature: who to trust, who to deceive, and when to strike. The fact that these documents endured for centuries proves one thing: betrayal wasn't an exception in medieval life. It was part of the fabric of power, woven into the very locks meant to keep secrets safe. And as we'll see next, the techniques they described weren't just about opening doors. They were about unlocking the minds of those who held the keys. Lock-picking guilds didn't just teach their members how to break into chests, they built entire networks of trust, secrecy, and coded communication. Imagine walking through the back alleys of 14th century Paris or Florence, where a discreet knock on an unmarked door could grant you entry to a hidden world. These guilds weren't lawless bands of thieves. Many operated with the tacit approval of city officials, who saw them as a necessary evil. In a time when locks safeguarded everything from tax records to military plans, having skilled lock-pickers on retainer was like holding a skeleton key to the kingdom's secrets. But membership came at a price. Initiation rituals were designed to test loyalty, often requiring apprentices to pick a lock under pressure or swear oaths of silence under penalty of death. The guild's most fascinating innovation wasn't their tools, it was their systems of encryption. Take the infamous Cipher of the Raven, a manual used by a Nuremberg guild that disguised lock-picking techniques as allegorical bird illustrations. To the untrained eye, it looked like a harmless book of fables, but to initiates, a raven's outstretched wing might reveal the exact angle to tilt a tension wrench, while the number of feathers in its tail corresponded to the pins in a specific lock model. This wasn't just about hiding knowledge from outsiders, it was about controlling betrayal from within. Guild masters knew that if every member could decipher the manuals, the secrets would spread like wildfire. So they doled out fragments, ensuring no single person held all the keys, so to speak. Disloyalty was met with brutal efficiency. Records from a Lyon guild describe a member who sold lock designs to a rival city. His punishment wasn't just expulsion, but the deliberate breaking of his fingers. It was a visceral warning. Betrayal robbed a lock-picker of their livelihood as surely as it robbed the guild of its power. Yet paradoxically, these same guilds sometimes became tools of state-sanctioned espionage. When a duke needed to infiltrate a rival stronghold, he didn't send soldiers battering down gates. He quietly hired a guild locksmith who could slip in and out like a shadow. In those moments, the very skills that made someone untrustworthy made them indispensable. The legacy of these guilds lingers in modern locksmithing traditions: the secret handshakes, the closed apprenticeships, even the way certain techniques are still referred to by medieval nicknames like the bishop's turn or the widow's whisper. But more importantly, they reveal a truth about betrayal. It thrives most where power is concentrated. The guilds didn't just exist to teach lockpicking, they existed to manage the fragile equilibrium between trust and deception. Every locked door in the Middle Ages was a question: who holds the knowledge to open this, and what will they do with it? The answers were never simple, because in a world where everyone had something to hide, even the guardians of secrets had their own locks to pick. Consider the court of a medieval king where whispers of conspiracy could topple empires. For the nobility, lock-picking wasn't a criminal skill, it was a weapon of statecraft. Kings and dukes didn't just keep locksmiths in their employ, they cultivated them as master spies, trained to slip into rival courts like ghosts. These operatives weren't after gold or jewels. Their real targets were scrolls sealed with wax, locked chests holding marriage contracts, or coded messages hidden in prayer books. A single picked lock could expose a plot, forge an alliance, or doom a rival family. The manuals of this era read like espionage handbooks, one 15th century text, likely commissioned by a Burgundian duke, included meticulous instructions on how to relock a mechanism after opening it, ensuring no trace of intrusion remained. Another advised wrapping tools in velvet to muffle the telltale scrape of metal on metal. These weren't just technical guides, they were lessons in psychological warfare. A perfectly picked lock left the victim unaware they'd been compromised, allowing false information to be planted or true secrets to be exploited at the perfect moment. The most skilled operatives could turn a rival's own locked chambers into traps, leaving behind forged letters that would unravel alliances from within. Take the infamous case of Enguerrand de Marigny, a trusted advisor to King Philip IV of France. In 1314, de Marigny's downfall came not from battle, but from a locked chest in his own quarters. Rival nobles, suspecting his loyalty, hired a locksmith to extract documents that painted him as a traitor. Whether the evidence was real or fabricated hardly mattered. The mere act of retrieving it from a secure space made the betrayal undeniable. This was the dark genius of medieval espionage. The lock itself became proof of guilt. If something was stolen from behind iron and wood, it must have been worth hiding. But the true masters of this game weren't just breaking locks, they were breaking trust. A lord might deliberately leave a decoy chest poorly secured, knowing spies would target it first while the real secrets lay elsewhere. Some manuals even describe poisoned locks, mechanisms designed to snap shut or mangle tools if tampered with, turning the act of betrayal into physical evidence. The psychological toll was profound. Nobles began seeing every locked door as both a shield and a potential snare, wondering if their closest confidants had been schooled in the art of silent entry. What's chilling is how these tactics blurred morality. A knight picking a lock to expose treason was hailed a hero, but the same act for personal gain was punishable by dismemberment. The manuals themselves reflected this duality, with some passages glorifying lock-picking as patriotic duty while others warned of its damnable risks. Even the church was implicated. Records show abbots secretly commissioning locksmiths to retrieve borrowed relics from rival monasteries. This wasn't just medieval cloak and dagger drama. The strategies born in these shadow wars shaped modern intelligence operations. The concept of plausible deniability, the use of compartmentalized secrets, even the practice of leaving false documents for enemies to find, all have roots in these locked chambers and the hands that knew how to open them. The real lesson wasn't about metal mechanisms, it was about human nature. When power is at stake, every lock has two faces. One keeps secrets in, the other lets betrayal out. Lock-picking manuals from the Middle Ages read like training guides for psychological warfare. The instructions didn't just teach how to manipulate tumblers and springs, they drilled students in the art of reading intentions. One 15th century manual from Venice warns, a lock is not merely iron and brass, it is the mind of its maker made solid. To pick it successfully, you had to think like the person who designed it, anticipating where they might have cut corners or overlooked vulnerabilities. This same principle applied to betrayal in royal courts and merchant guilds. Just as a locksmith's apprentice studied the quirks of different lock designs, a would-be betrayer studied their target's habits when they drank too much wine, which servants they trusted blindly, or which insecurities could be turned against them. The parallels between picking locks and manipulating people were uncanny. Manuals emphasized patience, advising readers to listen to the lock through their tools, feeling for subtle vibrations or resistance. In the same way, successful betrayers learned to listen to social dynamics, waiting for the perfect moment when a lord's guard was down or a rival's alliance showed cracks. A common exercise in advanced manuals involved picking a lock blindfolded, relying entirely on touch and sound, a skill that translated eerily well to navigating the whispered intrigues of medieval politics, where the most dangerous threats were the ones you couldn't see coming. Language mattered deeply in these texts. Terms like the gentle turn or the whispering key framed lock picking as a dialogue with the mechanism, not a brute force attack. This mirrored how betrayers often cloaked their actions in plausible deniability. A noble might plant seeds of doubt in a king's ear with carefully worded compliments. Surely you've noticed how your brother's loyalty seems rehearsed. Just as a skilled lock picker used minimal pressure to avoid triggering alarms, the manuals even shared a lexicon with courtly betrayal. Both spoke of testing defenses or finding the true binding point, whether referring to a lock's internal mechanism or a rival's emotional weak spot. Perhaps most revealing were the manual's warnings. Many cautioned against rushing the process, stressing that haste would break both the tool and the trust. This wasn't just practical advice, it reflected the calculated cruelty of medieval betrayal. The most devastating acts of treachery weren't explosive outbursts but slow, meticulous unravelings. Consider the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's advisor. His enemies didn't strike immediately. They spent months subtly warping the king's perception, turning Cromwell's own efficiency into evidence of arrogance until the lock of royal favor clicked shut against him. These texts also expose a grim irony. The very traits that made someone a master lockpicker, patience, attention to detail, emotional control, were the same qualities that made them a dangerous betrayer. Guilds knew this risk. Some required apprentices to swear oaths not just on tools but on relics, binding loyalty through divine fear. Yet the manual's survival proves how valuable these double-edged skills were. In a world where every locked chest held secrets and every smiling courtier might be a threat, understanding the psychology of betrayal wasn't just useful. It was the difference between wielding power and becoming its victim. The true legacy of these manuals isn't in the rusted tools they describe, but in their chilling reminder: the hardest locks to pick are the ones guarding human trust. The craftsmanship behind medieval lock-picking tools would put many modern gadgets to shame. These weren't crude implements, they were masterpieces of deception, forged with the precision of a watchmaker and the secrecy of a spy. Take the Nightcrawler, a slender pick made from tempered steel, its tip curved like a surgeon's probe to navigate labyrinthine lock mechanisms without a sound. Or the Silk Thief, a tension wrench so slender it could be threaded through the gap in a locked drawer like a needle through cloth. What's astonishing is how these tools mirrored the social hierarchies of their time. A nobleman's lock-picking set might be crafted from silver, disguised as writing implements, while a burglar's kit could include bone picks carved from deer antlers, quiet, durable, and easy to discard if caught. Disguise was just as critical as design. One manual from 1432 describes hollowing out a pilgrim's staff to hide picks, complete with a wax seal to mimic the look of an unbroken relic. Another suggests embedding tools in the handle of a dagger, turning a weapon into a lock-picking kit that would never raise suspicion, the most audacious. A German manual detailing how to forge a bishop's signet ring with a hidden compartment for picks, allowing operatives to move through guarded spaces with the authority of the church itself. These weren't just hiding places, they were psychological weapons. A guard might search a suspect's pockets, but who would dare demand a noblewoman remove her rosary or a monk his sacred ring? The ingenuity didn't stop at concealment. Some tools were engineered for specific locks, like the Raven's Beak, a hooked pick designed to bypass the intricate wards of Italian strongboxes. Others exploited human error, like the lazy smith's key, a blank that could turn poorly made locks by exploiting common flaws in casting. The most chilling were the silent sisters, picks wrapped in wool or leather to muffle the telltale scrape of metal, proving that medieval operatives understood the psychology of betrayal as keenly as its mechanics. A guard might stay alert for the clink of tools, but a soundless intrusion, that was the stuff of nightmares. What's truly revealing is how these tools blurred the line between criminal and craftsman. Guild locksmiths often made lock-picking devices to test their own work, creating an arms race between security and subterfuge. A chest's maker might design a lock with 6 pins, only for a rival to craft a 6-pronged spider key to defeat it. This cat-and-mouse game pushed both locks and tools to astonishing complexity, with some mechanisms requiring picks so delicate they were stored in velvet-lined cases to prevent warping. The legacy of these tools lingers today. Modern lock pickers still use variations of the hook and rake techniques described in medieval manuals, and the principle of the tension wrench remains unchanged after 700 years. But beyond mechanics, these artifacts teach us something deeper about betrayal. It's never just about force. The finest tools were those that left no trace, turning the act of breaking trust into something as invisible as a shadow sliding through a keyhole. In a world where power balanced on the edge of a well-hidden blade, the greatest threat wasn't the brute who smashed doors, it was the one who opened them without anyone ever knowing. History often paints medieval espionage as a man's world, but the truth is far more intriguing. Women moved through the shadows of lock-picking and betrayal with a stealth that made them doubly dangerous, not just because of their skills, but because society rarely saw them coming. Take the case of Marguerite de Brescia, a 15th-century noblewoman whose embroidery frames concealed hollow compartments for lock-picks. While her husband attended council meetings, she reportedly gathered intelligence by borrowing documents from locked scriptoria, her elaborate gowns masking the faintest jingle of tools. What made women like Marguerite so effective wasn't just technical ability, it was the perfect camouflage of expectation. In an era when men guarded castles, women guarded secrets. Some lock-picking manuals hint at this hidden world through coded language. A Venetian text from 1421 refers to the silent keys, a term modern scholars believe denoted female operatives trained to exploit the privacy of domestic spaces. Unlike male agents who might arouse suspicion lingering near a lord's strongbox, women could move freely through bedchambers and nurseries, places where locks protected everything from love letters to inheritance documents. Their tools reflected this subtlety. Archaeologists have uncovered hairpins with microscopic file marks, their tips reshaped into lock probes, and prayer books with gilt-edged pages hiding thin metal shims between the vellum. The church unwittingly became an accomplice to these covert networks. Convents, often seen as peaceful retreats, doubled as ideal smuggling hubs. A nun's habit could conceal lock picks in its woven girdle, while the monastery's scriptorium provided cover for copying stolen documents. Records from a French Inquisition trial reveal how Sister Allay of Provence allegedly picked the lock of a bishop's chest using a modified crucifix, returning it to the altar before dawn with no one the wiser. These women didn't just break locks, they weaponized the very institutions meant to constrain them. Noble households took advantage of this cultural blind spot. Daughters of influential families were sometimes discreetly trained in lockpicking, not as criminals but as safeguards. If a husband died suddenly, a widow who could access his locked records might save her family's lands from greedy relatives. When Elena of Aquitaine's court poet wrote of a lady whose fingers danced like spiders upon the king's iron secrets, he may have been referencing this very practice. The greatest power these women wielded was plausible deniability, after all. What medieval chronicler would dare accuse a high-born woman of manual trickery? The few surviving accounts of female lockpickers reveal a razor-sharp understanding of psychology. While men often relied on brute force or technical complexity, women operatives mastered the art of misdirection. A German manual describes a technique called the distracted hand, where a female picker would feign clumsiness, dropping a handkerchief or pretending to faint, to make guards focus anywhere but on the lock she was manipulating. Others exploited gendered assumptions by using perfumed wax to temporarily jam mechanisms, knowing servants would blame womanly frivolity rather than sabotage when keys stuck. These stories force us to reconsider medieval betrayal not as a breakdown of loyalty, but as a sophisticated dance of survival. For every queen accused of poisoning her husband, there were likely a dozen lesser noblewomen using lock-picks to secure their children's futures or protect vulnerable communities. The tools they left behind, a hairpin here, a prayer book there, are whispers of a truth history tried to lock away. When the stakes were highest, the most dangerous hands were often the ones society insisted should be folded in prayer. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of medieval cathedrals, where candlelight flickered across sacred relics, another kind of devotion was at work, one that traded prayer books for lock-picks. The church, despite its moral authority, became an unlikely stage for betrayal, with lock-picking manuals circulating among clergy like forbidden psalms. Consider the case of Abbot Gerard of Cluny, who in 1289 allegedly commissioned a locksmith to craft tools disguised as liturgical instruments, a crucifix with a removable base that concealed tension wrenches, or a censer whose chain links could be rearranged into lock probes. These weren't the acts of common thieves. They were calculated moves in a divine chess game, where accessing a rival bishop's locked correspondence could mean the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. The targets of these holy heists were as varied as the motives behind them. Monasteries housed everything from land deeds to apocalyptic prophecies, all guarded by locks blessed with holy water. A Cistercian manual from 1342 details how to exploit the weakness of St. Peter, a reference to warded locks whose mechanisms could be bypassed by mimicking the shape of a bishop's key. Some texts went further, instructing clerics on how to reseal wax seals after pilfering documents, using heated rings to replicate the imprint of authority. The irony was thick. The same hands that consecrated the Eucharist might also pick the locks protecting a rival's tithe records. What's truly startling is how these acts were rationalized. A fragment from a Dominican friar's diary defends lock-picking as God's work, arguing that uncovering hidden sins justified breaking earthly laws. This moral gymnastics reached its peak during the Inquisition, when interrogators used lockpicking to retrieve evidence of heresy from private chests. One manual even codified the practice with a chapter titled On Opening the Locks of the Unrighteous, suggesting that pious intent transformed trespass into virtue. The line between holy duty and hypocrisy blurred, especially when the same techniques were used to suppress reformist texts or silence internal dissent. The Church's lock-picking networks extended beyond individual actors. Scriptoriums, those hallowed spaces of transcription, sometimes doubled as espionage hubs. Scribes trained in copying sacred texts were ideally placed to alter documents or create forgeries, relying on lock-picks to access originals. A notorious example comes from Avignon, where a papal scribe named Brother Matteo was caught in 1351 with a set of picks hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible. His defense, he claimed the tools were used to free suppressed translations of scripture, a reminder that betrayal in the right hands could wear the mask of righteousness. These sacred betrayals left lasting scars on medieval Christianity. The very locks meant to protect relics and records became symbols of institutional paranoia. Cathedrals began installing elaborate lock mechanisms with God's eyes, tiny peepholes allowing guards to monitor anyone approaching a locked chest. Some monasteries adopted dual key systems, requiring 2 senior clerics to turn their keys simultaneously, a physical manifestation of distrust. Yet the manuals kept evolving, their authors one step ahead. A Benedictine text from 1420 advises picking such locks by inserting a heated wire to soften the wax seal on the second keyhole, tricking the mechanism into believing both keys were present. The legacy of this holy deception lingers in modern religious archives, where centuries-old locks still bear scratches from long-forgotten tools. More profoundly, it challenges our assumptions about medieval piety. Behind every act of sacred lock-picking lay a chilling truth. Even faith couldn't fully armor the human heart against ambition, fear, or the intoxicating promise of secrets unveiled. When betrayal wore a cassock, the click of a picked lock wasn't just sound. It was the echo of power shifting in the shadows of the divine. The moment a lock-picker's tools were discovered, their fate hung by a thread, sometimes literally. Medieval legal codes treated lock-picking not as petty theft, but as a fundamental violation of trust, punishable by horrors designed to deter others. In 1284, the English Statute of Winchester decreed that anyone caught with lock-picking tools could have their hands severed, a grim irony, rendering the very limbs that mastered locks incapable of holding so much as a spoon. But the punishments grew even more grotesque for those accused of using these skills against the powerful. A Parisian chronicle from 1312 describes a locksmith named Henry Le Tourneur, who was boiled alive after being caught opening the chest of a royal tax collector. His crime wasn't just theft, it was an assault on the crown's authority, turning a mechanical skill into an act of treason. What's chilling is how often lock-picking accusations became entangled with political purges. When the Duke of Burgundy needed to discredit a rival family in 1423, his agents planted lock-picks among their belongings, ensuring their execution for plotting against the sanctity of locked chambers. These weren't just legal proceedings, they were theatrical displays of power. In Nuremberg, convicted lock-pickers were sometimes forced to wear their tools around their necks during public executions, the metal instruments heated red-hot before being pressed against their skin. The message was clear: betrayal began with the first turn of a lockpick, yet the manuals themselves reveal a fascinating duality. Alongside diagrams of picks and tension wrenches, many included coded warnings about legal risks. One Venetian text from the 1400s advises readers to carry a guild membership badge when practicing, as craftsmen were often given lighter sentences. Another suggests disguising picks as medical instruments, knowing surgeons enjoyed greater legal protections. Some went further, teaching how to break tools mid-attempt to leave no evidence, a technique called the dying spider, where fragments resembled ordinary debris. The sheer creativity of these defenses speaks volumes about medieval society's obsession with locks as symbols of order. Breaking into a merchant's chest might mean the gallows, but picking a noble's lock could get you drawn and quartered. In 1620, a Spanish locksmith named Diego Ramirez faced the Inquisition not for heresy, but for allegedly crafting picks that could open cathedral donation boxes. His trial records claim the devices were endowed with infernal precision, blurring the line between mechanical skill and witchcraft. What's paradoxical is how these draconian laws coexisted with the widespread demand for lock-picking skills. Kings who executed locksmiths by morning would hire their guildmates by afternoon to breach enemy fortresses. The same courts that condemned lock-pickers as traitors relied on their expertise to authenticate seals or testify about tampered mechanisms. This hypocrisy wasn't lost on contemporaries. A satirical poem from 15th century England mocks a judge who hanged a man for picks at dawn, then begged their use by dusk. The legal records preserve one final irony. Many convicted lock-pickers were illiterate, meaning the very manuals that could have warned them of the risks were forever out of reach. Their fates remind us that in the Middle Ages, the line between artisan and criminal wasn't drawn in ink. It was etched in blood and iron, shifting with the whims of those who held the keys to justice. War transformed lock-picking from a shadowy craft into a battlefield necessity. Imagine a moonlit siege in 1485, where silent figures moved through the rubble of a breached castle wall, not to storm the gates, but to disable them from within. Medieval warfare manuals contain entire chapters on the quiet arts, detailing how a single skilled operative could neutralize drawbridge mechanisms or jam portcullis gears using nothing but a modified dagger and a length of wire. These weren't the grand strategies of knights and catapults. They were the unspoken tactics that decided which side would wake to find their armories empty or their escape routes sealed. The most notorious example comes from the Siege of Calais in 1347. English forces, unable to break the city's defenses, reportedly bribed a French locksmith to sabotage the main gate's locking bar. The resulting breach didn't come from battering rams, but from a carefully filed notch in the mechanism that snapped under pressure. What's fascinating is how these acts straddled the line between valor and villainy. That same locksmith was celebrated as a hero in England's court records, while French chronicles damned him as the key-bearing Judas. The manuals themselves reflect this moral ambiguity. One Burgundian text includes a prayer for lockpickers to cleanse their hands of treason's stain, suggesting even practitioners wrestled with the ethics of their craft. Siege warfare wasn't the only battleground. Supply lines became prime targets, with lock-pickers specializing in the art of ghost raids. Accounts from the 100 Years' War describe English raiders infiltrating French camps not to fight, but to silently open provision chests and replace grain with chalk or salt. The psychological impact was devastating. An army that couldn't trust its own locks soon couldn't trust its own leaders. Some manuals even taught how to exploit this paranoia, advising operatives to leave picked locks visibly undisturbed, letting the enemy waste hours searching for imaginary traitors among their ranks. The tools of wartime lock-picking evolved into specialized instruments. A 15th century German manual illustrates the Knight's Whisper, a hooked pick designed to manipulate the bulky iron locks on fortified doors without removing a gauntlet. Another shows the Sapper's Friend, a reinforced tension wrench capable of turning rusted mechanisms under immense pressure. But the most ingenious were the sleeping picks, tools coated with animal fat to silently lubricate noisy hinges, allowing entire gates to be opened without alerting sentries. These weren't just gadgets, they represented a fundamental shift in how war was waged. Where swords and arrows tested strength, lock-picks tested trust itself. Perhaps the ultimate testament to their strategic value lies in what happened after battles. Victorious armies routinely hunted down enemy locksmiths, not to execute them, but to press them into service. A Welsh chronicle from 1421 describes how King Henry V's forces captured a Breton lock-picker named Yves Le Serrurier at Agincourt, only to grant him lands and titles in exchange for training English operatives. This revolving door of allegiance shows how betrayal in wartime was less about personal loyalty and more about survival. The same hands that picked a lock for one king today might do so for his enemy tomorrow, their skills rendering national borders as permeable as the locks they bypassed. These wartime manuals reveal a brutal truth. In conflict, betrayal wasn't an aberration, it was institutionalized. Pages stained with candle wax and hurried marginal notes tell of lockpickers who worked both sides of a siege, their true allegiances known only to their paymasters. Some texts even include cipher-locked entries, suggesting their authors anticipated falling into enemy hands. The most haunting artifacts are the practice locks recovered from battlefield camps, their mechanisms worn smooth from relentless drilling. Each groove tells the same story. In war, trust was just another mechanism to be picked apart, one careful turn at a time. A lock was never just a lock in the Middle Ages. It was a miniature theater of power, its mechanisms acting out society's deepest anxieties about trust and control. The iron bolts securing a noble's chest didn't merely protect gold. They performed a ritual transforming raw metal into a symbol of unbreakable authority. Keys hung around the necks of abbots and mayors like sacred amulets, their teeth mirroring the jagged hierarchies of feudal life. And when lock-picking manuals dared to dissect these symbols, they weren't just teaching mechanics, they were staging quiet rebellions. Consider the Treatise of the Nine Locks, a controversial 15th century manual that framed each lock type as a philosophical puzzle. The King's Lock, it argued, represented blind obedience, its complex wards designed to convince people that authority was too intricate to question. But the manual's real provocation came next. By teaching readers to bypass such locks with simple wire hooks, it subtly suggested that power's complexity was often an illusion. This wasn't just instruction, it was subversion disguised as craftsmanship. Monastic scribes who copied these texts sometimes added their own commentary, comparing picked locks to the breaking of false oaths, revealing how deeply the symbolism resonated. The keys themselves carried layers of meaning. In many towns, surrendering the city keys during a siege was the ultimate act of submission, so lock pickers developed techniques to retrieve them without the enemy's knowledge. One manual from Toledo describes using heated oil to soften the wax seal around a keyhole, allowing stolen keys to be duplicated and returned before dawn. The symbolic victory was as potent as the strategic one. A town could appear conquered while secretly holding the means to its own liberation. Even the church's architecture reinforced this symbolism. Cathedral treasuries often featured locks with biblical scenes etched into their faces: Adam and Eve expelled by a turning key, or Samson betrayed as Delilah picks the locks of his secret strength. These weren't decorations, they were warnings, yet lock-picking manuals turned the imagery upside down. A German text from 1482 reimagined the Eden story, depicting the serpent as a lockpicker freeing humanity from the prison of ignorance. Such metaphors gave moral cover to those who saw themselves as truth-seekers rather than thieves. The most poignant examples come from the margins of society. Guild records mention beggar keys, crude lock picks carried by the poor, not for theft, but to access locked public wells or granaries during famines. When authorities condemned these tools as criminal, pamphlets circulated with woodcuts showing keys morphing into grasping noble hands, while beggar picks became rays of light. This visual rhetoric framed lock-picking as a moral duty when authority failed its people. What's remarkable is how these symbolic battles played out in everyday objects. Noblewomen's jewelry sometimes included lock-shaped pendants that could actually open their husbands' document chests, a silent claim to shared power. Merchant guilds commissioned locks with intricate false keyholes, knowing the real mechanism's location would become a test of membership trust. Even children's games reflected the tension, with popular wooden puzzles requiring players to pick their way through miniature castle gates. The manual's greatest trick was making betrayal ambiguous. By framing lock-picking as reading what the powerful have written in iron, they gave dissent a language of craftsmanship rather than violence. When a locksmith picked a tyrant's lock, was he a criminal or a translator decoding the unspoken rules of oppression? That question still lingers wherever locks symbolize control and hands dare to turn against them. History remembers the downfall of Piers Gaveston, favorite of King Edward II, as a tragic clash of power and jealousy, but few know lock-picking played a starring role. In 1311, Gaveston's enemies didn't just plot against him, they weaponized his own locked correspondence. A disgruntled baron named Thomas of Lancaster allegedly hired a locksmith to extract and alter letters from Gaveston's chest, fabricating evidence of treason that turned the king against his closest friend. The Locksmiths Manual describing this technique still exists, its margins crammed with notes about wax seal replication and parchment smoothing. What makes this betrayal so chilling isn't just the act itself, but how it exploited medieval assumptions about security. A locked chest wasn't just storage, it was a promise of authenticity. By violating that space, the conspirators didn't just steal documents, they shattered the very concept of trust at court. The theft of the Hungarian crown jewels in 1440 reveals an even darker truth. Sometimes the greatest betrayals came from within the guilds sworn to prevent them. When the crown vanished from its vault in Vyšehrad Palace, investigators found the lock intact, no hammer marks, no forced hinges. Only years later did a captured locksmith confess that the royal guild's master had crafted a duplicate key, its teeth filed to mimic wear patterns from years of turning. The manual detailing this technique, now housed in Vienna's archives, includes a haunting annotation. A lock believes what it is taught to expect. This wasn't just lock-picking, it was psychological warfare waged through iron and brass. Perhaps no story captures the era's moral complexity better than that of Jeanne de Clisson, the 14th century Lioness of Brittany. After her husband was executed for treason based on falsified evidence, Jeanne turned lock-picking into an instrument of vengeance. Chronicles describe how she infiltrated French strongholds using tools hidden in her hair ornaments, systematically accessing and destroying documents that could exonerate her husband's name. Her most brazen act, picking the lock of the Constable of France's private archive, wasn't about wealth or power, but rewriting history itself. The manuals she likely consulted survive in Brittany's maritime museums, their pages salt-stained from sea voyages, proof that betrayal could wear many faces. These stories reveal a pattern modern intelligence agencies would recognize. The most devastating betrayals often began with mundane access. When the Duke of Burgundy needed to discredit a rival in 1421, his agents didn't forge letters. They hired a locksmith to place genuine documents in the man's own locked chest, ensuring their discovery by investigators. A Nuremberg manual from this period chillingly labels this technique the gardener's trick, comparing it to planting seeds in prepared soil. The brilliance lay in its simplicity. Why fabricate evidence when you could make the target incriminate himself using his own trusted spaces? The legacy of these betrayals lingers in unexpected places. Next time you see a medieval portrait showing a nobleman with his hand resting on a locked chest, look closer. That gesture wasn't just about displaying wealth, it was a calculated performance of security, a visual promise that some secrets remained untouched. Yet as the manuals remind us, every lock held two stories, the one written in iron by its maker, and the one waiting to be told by the hand holding the pick. Early medieval lock-picking manuals read like primers for brute force, bent nails hammered into keyholes, heated rods jammed into mechanisms until the metal warped. These were the desperate acts of outsiders, those without access to guild secrets or noble patronage. A 9th century Frankish text describes the drunkard's method, slamming a lock repeatedly with a stone until its internal wards shattered. But as castles grew taller and chests more ornate, betrayal had to evolve from bludgeon to ballet. By the 12th century, manuals began emphasizing patience over power. The spider's touch technique taught lock pickers to apply pressure so delicate it could distinguish between individual pin tumblers, like feeling for the faintest vibration of a plucked harp string. This shift mirrored broader changes in medieval society. Just as cathedral builders replaced crude stonework with flying buttresses, betrayers realized subtlety could breach defenses that raw strength couldn't touch. A Burgundian manual from 1352 boasts of opening a count's strongbox without disturbing the dust atop it, calling the method the breath of a ghost. The arms race accelerated through the late Middle Ages. When lockmakers began adding false keyholes and rotating plates, manuals countered with the blind man's dance, using a feather dipped in lampblack to identify true mechanisms by where the soot stuck. Some texts included intricate wax models for practicing on replica locks, anticipating modern cybersecurities, white hat hackers who test systems to strengthen them. The most advanced techniques bordered on psychological warfare. A Venetian manual describes greasing lock components with rancid fat, ensuring the next legitimate keyholder would associate the smell of betrayal with their own trusted spaces. What's revealing is how these innovations tracked with medieval power structures. The same decades that saw universities develop formal logic produced lock-picking manuals with flowcharts for diagnosing lock types. When merchant banks began double-entry bookkeeping, guilds created matching, double-blind picking methods requiring two tools used in precise sequence. Even the language evolved. Early texts spoke of breaking locks, while 15th century manuals preferred persuading or conversing with them. The ultimate testament to this sophistication lies in surviving locks themselves. Museums display chests with internal mechanisms mangled by crude medieval attempts alongside others showing barely detectable tool marks, the difference between a sledgehammer and a surgeon's scalpel. These artifacts tell a silent story. In a world where trust was constantly being redefined, betrayal didn't just keep pace, it often led the way. The most enduring lesson from these manuals isn't about metal or mechanisms, but about human nature's relentless ingenuity, whether building walls or finding ways through them. Lock-picking wasn't just a skill, it became a language, a way for medieval thinkers to articulate the unspoken mechanics of betrayal. Philosophers like John of Salisbury wrote of trust as a kind of lock, its wards forged through years of loyalty, yet vulnerable to the subtle pick of deceit. This metaphor resonated because it captured betrayal's slow, deliberate nature. A lock didn't shatter under a single blow, it yielded to persistent pressure, just as trust collapsed not from one lie, but from the cumulative weight of hidden motives. Even troubadours wove the imagery into love poetry, comparing a lover's whispered secrets to the sly turning of a lock's heart, where intimacy itself became the tool that picked away at fidelity. The manuals leaned into this symbolism with startling self-awareness. A 15th century Venetian text prefaces its instructions with a warning. As the pick finds the binding pin, so flattery finds the binding weakness in a man's resolve. Another, disguised as a moral treatise, describes lock mechanisms as allegories for the human soul, false wards representing vanity, hardened pins symbolizing stubborn pride. These weren't just technical guides, they were mirrors held up to society, reflecting how easily the defenses of loyalty could be bypassed when one knew where to apply pressure. Art amplified these ideas. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, demons were often depicted picking the locks of prayer books or reliquaries, their tools morphing into serpentine tongues. The message was clear: betrayal slithered in through gaps in attention, not brute force. Even the architecture of cathedrals played with this metaphor. Some choir stalls featured carvings of foxes picking the locks of sheepfolds, a sly commentary on clerical corruption. The imagery was so pervasive that it bled into everyday speech. Court records show witnesses describing traitors as those who turned the key sideways, referencing the technique of raking a lock's pins simultaneously to overwhelm its defenses. What's most revealing is how these metaphors crossed social boundaries. Peasant folktales told of clever beggars outwitting greedy lords by picking the locks of overstuffed granaries, stories where betrayal became a moral leveling tool. Meanwhile, nobility commissioned locksmiths to craft puzzle locks with mechanisms mimicking courtly intrigue, their solutions requiring the same strategic thinking as navigating political alliances. A surviving German lock from 1482 features a mechanism that only opens when 3 separate picks are turned in harmony, a tangible lesson about the fragility of collective trust. The manual's greatest legacy might be how they forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Trust was never unbreakable, only inconvenient to bypass. By framing betrayal as a craft with rules and apprenticeships, they demystified it, making treachery something measurable and therefore manageable. When a medieval poet wrote of a traitor's hand that knew the lock better than the key, they weren't just condemning deceit. They were acknowledging its terrible intimacy, the way betrayal always required knowing what someone valued enough to lock away. That recognition still chills us today because the metaphor hasn't aged. Modern security systems may have replaced iron with encryption, but the human lock, the one guarding trust, still opens the same way, one careful turn at a time. The echoes of medieval lock-picking manuals reverberate through modern security systems in ways that would astonish their original authors. Walk into any locksmith's workshop today, and you'll hear terms like single pin picking or tension control, techniques meticulously documented in manuscripts from the 1400s. The double ball pick, a tool described in a Burgundian manual for manipulating complex warded locks, has its direct descendant in today's tubular lockpicks used for bicycle locks and vending machines. Even the basic principle of applying rotational pressure while probing pins remains unchanged after 6 centuries. These weren't just medieval tricks, they were the foundational algorithms of security breaches, algorithms we're still refining today. Beyond mechanics, these manuals pioneered psychological strategies that modern espionage agencies would recognize instantly. The Venetian method of distracting guards with noise while a second operative picks the lock mirrors contemporary diversion tactics used in cyber attacks and corporate espionage. More chillingly, the manual's emphasis on patience and observation, waiting for the perfect moment when a target's routine creates vulnerability, reads like a precursor to modern phishing schemes. A 15th century advice to study the keeper as closely as the lock could easily apply to today's social engineering hacks, where the weakest link isn't technology but human habit. The true legacy lies in how these texts forced societies to evolve their understanding of trust. After lock-picking manuals spread across Europe, we see the rapid development of detector locks, mechanisms designed to jam or alert owners if tampered with, much like today's intrusion detection systems. Banks began requiring dual-key systems where 2 officials had to turn their keys simultaneously, a principle now embedded in nuclear launch protocols and cryptocurrency multi-sig wallets. The manuals didn't just teach breaking security, they pressured civilizations to build better systems, creating an endless dance between lockmakers and lockbreakers that continues in cybersecurity labs and encryption debates. Curiously, these documents also shaped modern law. The very concept of breaking and entering as a distinct crime emerged directly from medieval court cases involving picked locks, where the violation of a mechanism became proof of intent. Legal scholars still reference 13th century precedents like the case of the broken seal when debating digital trespassing, because whether it's a wax imprint or a biometric scan, the core issue remains: what happens when someone bypasses a symbol of trust? Perhaps most haunting is how the manuals expose the unchanging nature of betrayal. The same rationalizations appear across 800 years, from the guildsman who claimed he picked locks only to test their strength, to the modern hacker arguing they expose vulnerabilities for the greater good. The marginal notes in these texts reveal eternal human struggles: a scribe's shaky handwriting confessing he copied the manual for knowledge, not theft, or a noblewoman's diary fretting that learning lock-picking made her complicit in her own paranoia. These fragile pages survived wars, purges, and time because they hold up a mirror we still can't look away from. In an age of retinal scans and blockchain, we've merely replaced iron pins with lines of code, but the essential question remains: how do we protect what matters when every lock, physical or digital, is just a challenge waiting to be solved? The medieval lock pickers left us an unexpected gift: not just the blueprints for breaking trust, but the tools to build it stronger. Their greatest lesson wasn't in the picks they crafted, but in the realization that no mechanism is ever truly unpickable, only perhaps not worth the effort yet. And that distinction changes with every generation's definition of what's precious enough to lock away. The same psychological chess game played out in medieval courts now unfolds in corporate boardrooms and digital chat rooms. A modern cybercriminal conducting a phishing scam employs the exact same principles as a 15th century locksmith picking a noble's chest. Both study their target's habits, identify the weakest point of entry, and apply precisely measured pressure. The hacker's social engineering tactics mirror the distracted hand technique from German manuals, where creating confusion became the key to bypassing defenses. Even the terminology overlaps. Modern security experts speak of warding off attacks, a direct linguistic descendant of the physical wards in medieval locks designed to block unauthorized keys. Corporate espionage reveals even starker parallels. When a disgruntled employee slowly exfiltrates sensitive data, they're reenacting the gardener's trick from Nuremberg manuals, planting seeds of betrayal within systems built on trust. The medieval practice of disguising lockpicks as everyday objects finds its counterpart in today's stealth malware hidden in routine software updates. And just as guild locksmiths swore blood oaths of secrecy, modern insider threats often exploit their legitimate access, proving that betrayal still wears the mask of loyalty centuries later. The most profound continuity lies in the arms race between security and subterfuge. Medieval lockmakers responded to picking techniques by creating false keyholes and rotating plates, ancestors of today's two-factor authentication and honeypot decoy systems. When Venetian merchants began using counterweighted locks that jammed if picked with excessive force, they were inventing the medieval equivalent of modern intrusion detection that locks accounts after suspicious activity. This eternal dance between innovation and exploitation shows that while our tools have evolved from iron to code, the underlying battle remains unchanged: how to protect trust in a world where someone will always seek to pick it apart. Yet there's a crucial difference the manuals couldn't anticipate: scale. Where a medieval betrayer might compromise a single chest, a data breach today can expose millions of digital lives. The cipher of the Raven, once decipherable by a handful of guild initiates, now manifests as zero-day vulnerabilities traded on dark web forums. This exponential growth in consequences makes the lessons from parchment pages more vital than ever. Understanding that betrayal isn't about technology but human psychology, the willingness to exploit trust, might be the most enduring inheritance from those shadowy figures who first turned locks into lessons. Perhaps the ultimate irony is how medieval countermeasures are being resurrected for the digital age. Cryptographers now study manual techniques like the blind man's dance, adapting their tactile sensitivity to detect anomalies in encrypted traffic. Ethical hackers employ the same systematic probing methods used on 14th century warded locks when penetration testing corporate networks. Even the concept of trust but verify, enshrined in modern security protocols, echoes the dual key systems of medieval monasteries where no single person held complete access. These threads connecting past and present reveal an uncomfortable truth about progress. We've replaced iron strongboxes with blockchain ledgers, wax seals with biometric scans, and whispered court intrigues with encrypted chat logs, yet the human hands guiding these tools remain driven by the same mix of ambition, desperation, and cunning. The lock-picking manuals survive not as historical curiosities, but as foundational texts in the unending story of how we guard what's precious and what happens when others decide those guards are meant to be picked. A 15th century manual from Burgundy opens with a startling question. Is it theft to open a door that guards stolen bread? This wasn't some philosophical musing. It was the lock-picking guilds wrestling with the ethics of their craft in real time. The text goes on to describe a scenario where a locksmith is hired to retrieve grain from a noble's locked granary during a famine, framing the act not as burglary but as divine realignment. What makes these medieval debates so fascinating is how they echo modern arguments about whistleblowing and ethical hacking. Just as today's cybersecurity experts debate when breaking into systems is justified to expose wrongdoing, medieval lockpickers developed their own moral frameworks for betrayal. One manual from 1423 outlines 3 just causes for picking locks: to prevent greater harm, to reclaim what was unjustly taken, or to test security at a lord's request. The last point reveals an unexpected twist. Some nobles actively employed lock-pickers as medieval penetration testers, rewarding those who could breach their chests to prove where defenses failed. This practice blurred lines between criminal and consultant, much like contemporary white-hat hackers who legally expose vulnerabilities. A Nuremberg guild's records even show disputes over whether members should refuse certain jobs, with one entry noting a master locksmith's resignation after being ordered to access a rival merchant's private ledgers. The church's involvement added another layer of complexity. Manuscripts from monastic scriptoriums contain passages where clerics argued that picking locks to recover misplaced church property wasn't sin but duty. One particularly creative justification compared Christ driving money changers from the temple to a locksmith reclaiming stolen relics. Yet the same texts warn that the toolmaker shares in the sin if their picks are used for evil, a medieval precursor to debates about tech companies' responsibility for their products' misuse. These ethical tensions exploded during political upheavals. When the citizens of Ghent revolted in 1539, rebel locksmiths published a pamphlet defending their right to pick city armory locks, arguing that tyranny had voided normal moral codes. The counterargument came from a royalist manual depicting those same locksmiths as demons picking the gates of hell. What began as technical instructions had become ideological weapons, with each side weaponizing the ethics of lock-picking to justify or condemn rebellion. Perhaps most poignant are the personal reckonings preserved in marginal notes. A trembling hand in one manual's margin confesses, "I showed the Baron how to open his brother's chest yesterday. Was it wisdom or wickedness?" Another bears a later addition, God forgive me, the gold bought my silence. These raw hesitations reveal how medieval people navigated moral gray areas we still grapple with today. When is betrayal actually loyalty to some higher truth? Can breaking trust ever be the honorable choice? The manuals offer no easy answers, only proof that these dilemmas are as old as locks themselves and likely as enduring. Lock-picking seeped into the very fabric of medieval storytelling, transforming from a shadowy skill into the stuff of legend. Folktales across Europe spun variations of the clever locksmith who outwitted corrupt lords, like the German fable of Hans the Light Fingers, who picked his way into a baron's treasury only to redistribute the gold to starving villagers. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were cultural pressure valves, allowing common people to fantasize about flipping the script on power. Even children's rhymes played with lock imagery. A French counting song from the 1300s describes 10 little keys, 9 little thieves, embedding the tension between security and subversion into everyday language. The legal world absorbed these anxieties too. Property laws evolved elaborate clauses around broken seals and violated locks, where the mere evidence of tampering carried more weight than the value of stolen goods. A fascinating case from 14th century England saw a merchant successfully sue his neighbor not for theft, but for breach of trust through lock manipulation, proving the psychological damage of violated security could outweigh material loss. Town charters began requiring guilds to register their lock designs, creating early intellectual property protections, while courts kept confiscated lockpicks as evidence, displayed like weapons in murder trials. Art and religion mirrored this obsession. Church frescoes depicted St. Peter holding not just the keys to heaven, but a locksmith's tension wrench, symbolizing divine judgment as the ultimate lock audit. Cryptics showed Judas picking the locked money chest of the temple, his tools morphing into serpent tails. Even festive traditions got in on the symbolism during Carnival in Venice. Revelers wore masks with tiny lock motifs, winking at the city's reputation for espionage. The message was clear. In a world where trust was fragile, everyone played both lockmaker and lockbreaker depending on circumstance. The manuals themselves became cultural artifacts beyond their practical use. Wealthy collectors commissioned illuminated versions with marginal doodles of monkeys picking locks, a satirical jab at human folly. Poetry anthologies included verses comparing love to a flawed lock mechanism, so easy to turn when new, so stubborn with time's rust. This cross-pollination between technical craft and creative expression reveals how deeply lock-picking resonated as a metaphor for all forms of human vulnerability. Perhaps the most enduring cultural impact was on language itself. Modern phrases like locking horns, key insights, or picking someone's brain all trace back to medieval lock-picking terminology. The French idiom, tourner la clé dans la plaie, turning the key in the wound, originates from guild debates about betrayal's lingering damage. Even the word trick in English owes its double meaning, both deception and skill, to locksmiths who performed tricks of the trade that blurred ethical lines. These threads, folklore, law, art, and language, converge into a startling realization. Medieval people didn't just use locks to protect property. They used lock-picking stories to navigate much messier territories, power imbalances, moral ambiguity, the thin line between justice and revenge. When a minstrel sang of a rogue picking a tyrant's lock, audiences didn't just cheer for the thief, they were rehearsing the idea that no authority was impervious, no hierarchy permanently sealed. The manuals that taught physical lock manipulation inadvertently taught something far more subversive: how to pick apart the mental locks that kept whole societies in place. Medieval artists and writers couldn't resist the dramatic potential of a lock pick in motion. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, nimble-fingered devils crouch over treasure chests, their tools gleaming like extensions of their claws, a visual shorthand for temptation itself. Yet turn the page, and you might find Saint Michael picking the locks of hell to free trapped souls, his divine mission framed with the same mechanical precision as any guild manual. This duality reveals society's deep ambivalence. Was the lock-picker a criminal mastermind or a liberator? The answer often depended on whose secrets were being cracked open. Take the 12th century epic Raoul de Cambrai, where the rebel Bernier picks a castle gate lock to expose a lord's treachery, only to later use the same skill to steal sacred relics. The poet lingers on the moment his pick sings to the iron like a lover's whisper, blurring the line between violation and virtuosity. Even Chaucer's Canterbury Tales plays with this tension. The Pardoner's description of thieves includes a locksmith whose hands knew more of heaven's grace than his heart, suggesting skill could outpace morality. These layered portrayals didn't just entertain, they let audiences safely explore the seduction of betrayal from the comfort of a fireside tale. The manuals themselves leaned into this storytelling tradition. One Burgundian text from 1462 illustrates picking techniques through allegorical woodcuts. A fox picking a vineyard gate becomes "the clever overcome the greedy," while a nun easing open a convent door is labeled "necessity breaks vows." Such imagery transformed dry instructions into moral parables, inviting readers to ponder when betrayal might be justified. The most provocative manuals borrowed from Romance literature, framing lock mechanisms as damsels in distress. The true binding pin waits to be freed by her champion's touch, a bizarre yet effective way to glamorize subterfuge. Artistic depictions also served as covert training tools. A stained glass window in Chartres Cathedral shows Samson breaking the gates of Gaza, but keen-eyed locksmiths would notice the detailed rendering of the lock mechanism, its wards and pins accurate enough to replicate. Similar hidden lessons appear in tapestries and even heraldry. The coat of arms for the Lockmeyer family of Nuremberg features crossed skeleton keys above a picked lock, their teeth arranged to demonstrate the raking technique. This blending of art and craft hints at a startling truth. Medieval people expected to encounter lock-picking symbolism in their daily lives, whether in church or at court. The ultimate testament to this cultural fixation lies in what didn't survive. Church ledgers record payments for now-lost frescoes showing the devil teaching lock-picking at Bologna University, while play scripts mention comedies where bumbling guards fail to notice pickpockets mimicking their keys. These vanished works suggest lock-picking permeated popular culture far more than surviving artifacts reveal. Perhaps the most poignant loss is the legendary Book of the Locked Heart, a 15th century anthology of poetry comparing love's vulnerabilities to picked mechanisms. Its only remaining description praises how it turned betrayal into verse that could charm even the bolts of heaven. What unites these fragments is their refusal to simplify. Where modern stories often cast hackers as unambiguous villains or antiheroes, medieval art embraced the messy reality that every lock has two sides, one that keeps secrets and one that begs to be opened. The next time you see a Renaissance painting of Gabriel blowing his trumpet on Judgment Day, look closely. Some artist hid a tiny lockpick in his other hand, a sly reminder that even divine justice might require the right tools. Medieval locks were far more than simple iron contraptions. They were puzzles crafted in metal, each one a testament to the ingenuity of its maker. At their core, most relied on warded mechanisms where internal obstructions called wards blocked all but the correct key. The precision was astonishing. A key's notches had to align perfectly with the lock's hidden channels, like a dancer navigating a maze in the dark. But what made these devices truly remarkable was their psychological dimension. A lock wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a performance of security designed to intimidate as much as deter. The sheer weight of an iron padlock or the ornate complexity of a chest's mechanism sent a clear message. What lay inside was valuable enough to guard with artistry. Lock-picking manuals dissected these designs with almost surgical reverence. A Burgundian text from 1468 breaks down a typical warded lock into 12 distinct components, each with poetic names like the Sentinel for the primary ward or the Bride for the delicate spring that released the bolt. This terminology wasn't just whimsy, it reflected how medieval minds anthropomorphized mechanisms, attributing human-like roles to inanimate parts. Mastering a lock meant understanding its personality. Some resisted pressure stubbornly, while others yielded to gentle persuasion. The manuals advised testing each component as one might probe a rival's loyalty through gradual, calculated engagement. The real breakthrough came when lock-pickers realized every mechanism had a weakness born from its own sophistication. High-security locks with multiple wards often suffered from a fatal flaw. Their complexity created predictable patterns. A Flemish manual illustrates this with a side-by-side sketch of a noble's chest lock and a tree's growth rings, noting how both repeated designs' nature never meant to be secrets. By studying dozens of locks from the same workshop, operatives could reverse engineer the lockmaker's habits. Perhaps the smith always placed the stiffest spring on the left, or favored triangular notches over square ones. This systematic approach turned betrayal into a science of observation and repetition. Some locks fought back with deception. The liar's lock, popular in Italian city-states, featured false keyholes that snapped shut on inserted tools, trapping the picker's device as evidence. Others incorporated blind wards, internal obstructions invisible from the keyhole that shattered poorly made picks. But even these countermeasures became lessons in the manuals. A German text advises wrapping picks in wet leather to mold around hidden wards, then letting them dry into custom tools, a technique still used by forensic locksmiths today. The most ingenious defenses backfired spectacularly. When Venetian locksmiths began embedding shards of glass in wax-filled mechanisms, pickers simply used magnets to extract the fragments before beginning their work. What emerges from these pages is a profound irony. The more elaborate the lock, the more it revealed about its maker's fears. A noble who commissioned a chest with 7 separate keyholes wasn't just protecting jewels, he was advertising how many enemies he suspected. Lock-pickers exploited this psychology mercilessly. They knew a ruler who changed his locks monthly was likely paranoid, making him vulnerable to misinformation. Conversely, a merchant who reused the same simple mechanism across all his properties offered thieves a master key in the form of predictability. The true art wasn't in forcing the lock, but in listening to what its design whispered about the mind behind it. This interplay between creator and breaker pushed both crafts to new heights. As lock-picking spread, locksmiths responded with mechanisms that anticipated their adversaries' moves. The twisting heart lock, invented in Normandy around 1420, had a central cylinder that rotated unpredictably when probed, confounding even seasoned pickers. Others incorporated musical elements, tiny bells that chimed if the lock was disturbed, or strings that hummed at certain tensions to guide legitimate keys. These weren't just security features, they were taunts, a lockmaker's way of turning the picking process into a high-stakes game. The manuals capture this arms race in vivid detail, their margins crammed with updates as new lock designs emerged. What began as straightforward instructions evolved into sprawling tactical guides, complete with fold-out schematics and cipher-locked appendices reserved for master pickers. In these pages, betrayal shed its cloak of spontaneity and revealed its true nature, a patient, almost scholarly pursuit where every click of a tumbler was a sentence in a larger conversation between those who built trust and those who unpicked it. The locks may have been forged in iron, but the real battle played out in the minds of those who sought to understand them. A nobleman's lock-picking manual and a peasant's might as well have been written in different languages. For the wealthy, these texts read like political strategy guides, delicate techniques for discreetly accessing rivals' correspondence or verifying a servant's loyalty by testing chest security. Their tools were works of art, silver picks disguised as writing quills, or tension wrenches hidden in sword hilts. One 15th century manual for Italian aristocrats even advised coating tools in lavender oil to leave no trace of metal scent, turning betrayal into an olfactory illusion. Meanwhile, commoners' manuals focused on brutal pragmatism, how to pick a grain store's padlock during famine using a hardened bread crust, or jam a tax collector's strongbox with a wedge of animal bone. The same skill that meant courtly intrigue for nobles meant survival for the poor. This class divide played out in startling ways. Wealthy patrons often commissioned locksmiths to create deceptive mechanisms specifically designed to fail under certain conditions, allowing staged betrayals to test allies. A Burgundian duke's records describe a chest with a compartment that silently released dyed powder onto a picker's hands, not to stop theft, but to identify which household member had been tempted. For peasants, the stakes were visceral. Folktales from the period tell of entire villages secretly pooling knowledge to pick the locks on feudal lords' storehouses during crop failures, viewing it not as crime but moral justice. The law predictably disagreed. While a noble caught lockpicking might face temporary exile, a peasant risked losing their hands or worse. The manuals themselves reinforced these divides through coded language. Texts for elite audiences spoke of persuasion and dialogue with the mechanism, framing betrayal as intellectual sport. Commoners' manuals used visceral metaphors. One German pamphlet described lock-picking as fighting the iron bear in its den, complete with illustrations showing picks as hunting spears. This wasn't just stylistic difference, it reflected how each class experienced power. For nobles, betrayal was a chess move. For the poor, it was combat. Ironically, the wealthy's obsession with security often created vulnerabilities the poor exploited. Ornate locks on merchant chests typically had more wards but weaker springs. Flashy displays meant to intimidate rather than truly secure. Street thieves knew this, targeting showy mechanisms while avoiding the plain iron locks on peasants' doors, which prioritized function over appearance. A thriving black market emerged for noble blanks, crude keys that could open entire categories of status-conscious merchants' locks precisely because their designs followed fashionable trends. The ultimate testament to this class divide lies in the artifacts themselves. Museum collections show noble locks mangled by careful, deliberate picking, evidence of patient espionage. Commoners' locks, by contrast, often bear marks of frantic scraping, telling stories of hunger and desperation. Both groups shared the same restless fingers turning the same cold metal, but where one saw opportunity, the other saw necessity. The manuals preserved these contrasting worldviews side by side, their pages whispering that betrayal, like justice, wore different faces depending on who held the pick. Medieval lock-picking manuals didn't just teach technique, they whispered in riddles, wrapping dangerous knowledge in poetry to shield it from prying eyes. Take the Treatise of the Nine Petals, a 15th century text that described lock mechanisms as blooming flowers, each petal representing a pin tumbler that had to be persuaded to unfold. To the untrained, it read like botanical lore, but initiates new, plucking the rose at midnight, meant bypassing a specific type of cathedral lock under cover of darkness. This linguistic masquerade wasn't just about secrecy. It transformed mechanical instructions into an art form, where every metaphor was a blade that could cut both ways. The euphemisms grew richer with each generation. A German manual from 1482 referred to tension wrenches as the widow's sigh, a nod to how gently they should be turned, like comforting a grieving spouse. Venetian texts spoke of walking the blind friar through his cloister, a vivid analogy for feeling one's way through an unfamiliar lock's wards. Even the tools themselves earned poetic aliases. Skeleton keys became ghost fingers, and lock picks were iron whispers. This wasn't mere whimsy. By cloaking their craft in allegory, lock pickers ensured that confiscated manuals read like mystic drivel to authorities while remaining crystal clear to those who knew the key literally, to decoding them. Some manuals took inspiration from sacred texts to avoid suspicion. A French manuscript disguised as a psalter contained verses like, "Let my hands move as the dove flies, finding the path the Maker hid from sinners," which guild members understood as instructions for raking pin tumblers in a prayer box lock. Others borrowed from courtly love poetry, comparing a stubborn lock to a chaste maiden's heart that required patient wooing. The most ingenious hid their secrets in plain sight by embedding lock-picking diagrams into marginal doodles of garden vines, where leaves and thorns traced the exact angles for tension tools. The parallels to medieval espionage run deep. Just as these manuals used flowery language to mask their purpose, spies communicated through seemingly innocent merchant ledgers or troubadour songs. A baker's recipe for 12 loaves might encode the number of guards at a city gate, while a love ballad's refrain could signal a meeting place. This shared lexicon of deception reveals a society where every profession from locksmith to minstrel understood that words were merely another lock to be picked when necessary. Decoding these manuals today is like eavesdropping on a 7-century-old conspiracy. When a text from Milan mentions the blacksmith's daughter who sings to iron, modern scholars recognize it as a reference to using heated tools to soften lock mechanisms. A Welsh fragment advising students to follow the crow's left wing turns out to describe the counterclockwise rotation needed for Celtic puzzle locks. Each deciphered phrase pulls back another curtain on a world where trust was so fragile, even knowledge had to wear a disguise. What's most striking is how these linguistic tricks mirrored the physical ones. Just as a lockpicker manipulated metal pins with subtle pressure, the manual's authors toyed with language, bending words until they sprung open with hidden meaning. The result was a self-perpetuating cycle of secrecy. The more authorities cracked down on lockpicking, the more inventive the metaphors became, until the art of betrayal was itself locked away in plain sight, waiting for the right reader to turn the key. Lockpicking wasn't always the tool of spies and schemers. Sometimes it became the weapon of the desperate. Imagine a village in the grip of famine, its granary padlocks gleaming under torchlight as children wail with hunger. In those moments, the lockpick wasn't an instrument of greed but rebellion, a way to turn the ironclad symbols of authority against themselves. Records from the Great Famine of 1315 describe peasants in Flanders using bent scythe blades to open noble storehouses, their actions justified in scrawled manifestos as taking back what the rain and earth owed them. These weren't thieves in the night. They were fathers and mothers turning the mechanisms of oppression into tools of survival. The manuals themselves occasionally let this revolutionary purpose slip through their coded language. A German text from the 1400s includes a curious passage advising readers to grease the wards with the fat of justice when confronting the locks of false lords. Another, disguised as a farmer's almanac, diagrams how to pick the distinctive horizontal bolts used on tax collectors' chests, noting the technique is most effective under a new moon, precisely when raids on tax offices were common. These weren't just technical instructions, they were quiet calls to arms wrapped in the sterile language of craftsmanship. Rebels understood the psychological power of a picked lock long before modern activists occupied buildings or hacked systems. During the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, insurgents didn't just batter down castle gates, they silently disarmed them, leaving the mechanisms intact but useless. A chronicler from Kent describes the terror this inspired in the nobility. For if the commonest hand could undo the mightiest iron, what else might they unravel? The act sent a message far beyond the physical breach. It proved the invincible was vincible, that every barrier was just a puzzle waiting to be solved. Some manuals went further, framing lock-picking as a sacred duty. A radical Franciscan sect surviving text, The Keys of St. Peter, argues that Christ's overturning of the money changers' tables sanctified the breaking of unjust locks. Its pages include prayers for steady hands and pure purpose, alongside diagrams for bypassing the intricate warded locks on ecclesiastical tithe chests. This moral framework transformed betrayal into divine intervention, not stealing bread, but reclaiming it in the name of a higher justice. The tools of these defiant acts were often improvised from everyday objects, turning the mundane into instruments of resistance. A French folktale tells of a blacksmith's daughter who picked a bailiff's lock using her hairpin, then melted the pin down to forge a nail for her village rebuilt well. The story's symbolism was deliberate. The same object that undermined authority could rebuild community. Real-life artifacts confirm this ingenuity. Museum collections include lock picks fashioned from fishing hooks, knitting needles, even the rib bones of salted herring. These humble materials whispered a revolutionary truth. You didn't need noble steel to challenge noble power. What's often overlooked is how these acts forced systemic changes. After waves of grain store break-ins in Lombardy, some lords switched to hiring locksmiths from peasant families, hoping their loyalty to kin would outweigh their craft. The opposite occurred. These smiths designed locks that appeared formidable but could be opened with a twist of a barley stalk, embedding solidarity into the very mechanisms meant to suppress it. The manuals capture this arms race in real time, with later editions cautioning students to beware locks made by hungry hands, as their simplicity often concealed deliberate vulnerabilities. The legacy of this rebellious lock-picking lingers in modern protest tactics. When activists use homemade tools to dismantle fences or disable surveillance equipment, they're channeling the same spirit as those medieval villagers turning the master's tools against the master's house. The difference is scale, not intent. Those centuries-old manuals didn't just teach how to bypass iron. They taught how to dismantle the idea that power's locks were ever truly unbreakable. In the right hands, betrayal wasn't a crime, it was a correction. Alchemy and lockpicking shared more than just medieval workshop space, they spoke the same secretive language. A 15th century manual from Prague opens with an alchemical motto: as the key turns base metal to gold, so the mind turns obstruction to opportunity. This wasn't mere poetry. Alchemists and lockpickers both dealt in transformations, one seeking to transmute elements, the other to bypass barriers, and their tools often overlapped in startling ways. The same delicate probes used to test the purity of metals could feel for a lock's binding pins, while alembics for distilling acids doubled as containers for lock-picking oils. But the true connection ran deeper than shared equipment. It was a meeting of worldviews where every locked door became a metaphor for nature's hidden truths. The Emerald Tablet, that foundational alchemical text, declared, "As above, so below," a principle lockpickers took literally. Manuscripts from the period show lock mechanisms diagrammed like planetary orbits, with pins representing celestial bodies that had to be aligned. One bizarre manual from Krakow even instructs students to practice picking during specific astrological hours, claiming Saturn's influence stiffens the wards while Mercury's touch loosens them. This cosmic thinking reflected a profound belief that understanding any system, whether a chest lock or the universe, required discovering its hidden symmetries. When an alchemist wrote of dissolving and coagulating matter, a lock-picker heard instructions for manipulating a lock's components. Symbolism blurred the lines between these crafts completely. Alchemical texts referred to the philosopher's stone as the key to all doors, while lock-picking manuals described skeleton keys as earthly stones. The most telling overlap was in their shared obsession with purity. Alchemists sought unblemished metals for transmutation, just as lock-pickers prized flawless steel for their tools. A Burgundian manuscript warns against using impure picks as sternly as any alchemical tract decrying contaminated mercury. Both traditions understood that imperfection meant failure, whether in unlocking matter's secrets or a noble strongbox. Some manuals took this fusion to mystical extremes. The Liber Ignis, Book of Fire, ostensibly about metallurgy, contains coded passages where instructions for forging lock picks mirror alchemical formulae. A recipe for dragon's bone, alloy supposedly used to make picks that could soften any iron, reads like standard alchemical nonsense until you realize it's describing a process to create non-sparking tools for covert work. Other texts disguise lock-picking techniques as allegorical journeys, where the pick becomes a seeker navigating the 7 gates of wisdom, each ward representing a planetary metal or alchemical stage. To the untrained eye, it was spiritual seeking to initiate a technical guide. This crossover reached its peak in the courts of Renaissance princes, where alchemist locksmiths became prized intelligence assets. Emperor Rudolph II kept a locksmith named Cornelius who supposedly crafted picks from metals bathed in lunar rays, blending mysticism with practical espionage. More pragmatically, alchemical laboratories provided perfect cover for lock-picking experimentation. The furnaces and odd apparatus explained any strange sounds or smells. A surviving inventory from a Milanese noble's estate lists alchemical tools that modern scholars recognize as sophisticated lock-picking kits, their components disguised as crucibles and retorts. The darkest connection lay in how both traditions rationalized betrayal. Alchemists justified secrecy as protection for the unworthy, while lockpickers framed their skills as tests of divine will. If God hadn't meant locks to be picked, he wouldn't have made them vulnerable. One chilling manual from Seville merges these arguments, claiming that successfully picking a lock proves the picker is among the elect destined to uncover hidden knowledge. This moral gymnastics allowed practitioners to see themselves as truth seekers rather than thieves, whether they were cracking the codes of matter or the locks guarding state secrets. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this fusion is in our language. When we speak of unlocking potential or key insights, we're channeling the alchemical lock-picking worldview that saw every barrier as a riddle waiting to be solved. The manuals that blended these arts didn't just teach how to open locks, they taught how to think in parallels, finding the hidden mechanisms that connect seemingly unrelated worlds. In an age where knowledge itself was locked away, the real philosopher's stone might have been the ability to turn any obstacle into an opportunity. Those preserved lock-picking manuals from the Middle Ages do far more than diagram how to manipulate tumblers and wards. They crack open an entire world, where trust was both the lock and the key to power. Think about the sheer audacity of scribes painstakingly copying these texts by candlelight, knowing full well they were preserving knowledge that could unravel the social order. Each manual was a paradox, a betrayal committed in ink to teach future betrayals, passed down through generations like some forbidden inheritance. The guilds that guarded these secrets understood something profound, that in a world where every locked chest held someone's vulnerability, mastering deception wasn't just a skill, it was survival. Consider the broader implications. These manuals didn't exist in a vacuum. They flourished in an era when a noble's authority was literally embodied by the weight of his iron locks, when the church's power hinged on controlling access to sacred texts. The very act of writing down lock-picking techniques was revolutionary, democratizing knowledge that threatened to destabilize hierarchies. It's no accident that the golden age of these manuals coincided with the rise of merchant classes and the slow crumbling of feudalism. Every time a locksmith's apprentice memorized the gentle turn technique, they weren't just learning a mechanical process, they were absorbing the subversive idea that no barrier was truly permanent. Fast forward to our digital age, and the parallels are eerie. Modern encryption algorithms are the new ward and pin systems, their complexity designed to intimidate as much as protect. Cybercriminals study firewall vulnerabilities with the same meticulous patience as a medieval locksmith probing for a lock's binding pin. Even the language persists. We still talk about backdoor access and skeleton keys when describing digital breaches, unconsciously echoing terms coined in those candlelit workshops centuries ago. The real lesson isn't about the evolution of security technology. It's about the unchanging nature of human psychology. Whether it's a 13th century scribe hiding lock-picking diagrams in a prayer book or a modern hacker masking malware in a PDF, the dance between trust and betrayal follows the same steps. What makes these manuals truly timeless is their unflinching honesty about power. They don't romanticize betrayal as the work of mustache-twirling villains. They present it as a calculated choice, often made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The marginal notes tell the real story. A guild apprentice's shaky handwriting confessing he copied a manual to feed his family, or a noblewoman's journal debating whether teaching her daughter to pick locks was empowerment or recklessness. These voices remind us that ethics have always been messy, and that the line between hero and villain often depends on who's holding the quill when history gets written. So the next time you turn a key in a lock or type a password into your phone, pause for a moment. That simple act connects you to a chain of human ingenuity and suspicion stretching back to the Middle Ages. The locks in your life, whether they're made of iron or lines of code, aren't just barriers, they're questions. Who do we trust, why, and what happens when that trust gets picked apart? If this journey through history's shadowy corridors has left you with one thing, let it be this: trust is never just about the mechanism. It's about the hands that made it, the hands that tried to open it, and the centuries of wisdom and warning whispering in between. For more explorations of history's untold stories, subscribe and join us as we keep picking apart the past, one fascinating layer at a time. Stay curious, but maybe double-check who's got copies of